Hoćeš da sedneš? Hoćeš da sedneš?
Ima ovdje stolica.
Ako hoćeš da sedneš.
Što niko nije upravo prije našeg kao?
Nije, sedi. Sedi. Slobodno. Šta piše tamo?
Are we working on Chatham? Are we working on Chatham? I should be more diplomatic.
Did I say anything?
I know you look.
That was,
He has a Swiss watch.
I'm probably the most unspeaking guy.
We spoiled him. I mean, he spent too much time with Balkan.
I grew up with too many people from the Balkans. I took on some of that. I said,
Be relaxed.
take some freedom during the time.
Stretchable time.
Actually, normally I'm late because I'm doing too many things.
Exactly. I have the same idea. I can just do that in 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay, I've got 5 minutes left. Okay, let's quickly do this. That will take 7 minutes or 12 minutes.
There is no time for waste. That's it. Absolutely.
It's only 10:30 in Brussels. And it's only 9:30 in London. So we're still up there.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning again. Good morning again, I said. I think it's about time to start the second session. And before we start, there is a housekeeping thing that we found a ring. And this is a lady's ring. I'm not going to propose a lady whose ring is this, I'm married. But still, if someone realizes that you lost the ring, and it looks like the proposal ring, come back to, well, I think here at the desk and pick it up. I think it's quite important, don't miss it. Okay, so welcome to the second session, which is titled Multi-Stakeholder Internet Governance Mechanisms, Approaches at the National Level. That definitely promises to be one of the most boring sessions of these 2 days. And we're going to try our best not to do it that way. When I saw for the first time the alias, and I like this approach, the multi-C model, I got a kind of resemblance of Holy See. I don't know why I read it that way, but in fact, there is a background of that. Multi-stakeholderism is something, or multi-stakeholder model is something that has been around ever since the World Summit on Information Society and the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, which is 10 plus years already. I don't know if anyone of you had a chance or a motive to count the number of times we mentioned multi-stakeholder in the previous session. But I think it counts over 50 or probably more, which gives some signal. And when I mentioned Holy See that came into my mind, it's because the multi-stakeholder became a kind of a buzzword in these 10 years. A buzzword which is to some extent even holy. You don't question it. You don't really discuss much about it. Internet governance needs to be multi-stakeholder. Okay, why? So that is something that we're going to try to do today. Try to decode. What does that mean? What the heck means multi-stakeholder in practice? We know that it's a cooperation kind of thing, but how does it work? We have a distinguished set of guests here. I'll start from my right. We have Hristov, Ministry of Transport, Information Technology and Communications. Ministry. The letters are small, yeah. Okay. Well, I just wanted to upgrade you, come on. We have Thomas Schneider, Federal Office of Communication, OFCOM of Switzerland. The only lady today, unfortunately, but there is many ladies around there. Megan Richards, Directorate General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology, European Commission. I have to read it in order not to make a mistake. Dušan Stojičević, Serbian National Register of Internet Domain Names, RNIDS of Serbia. And Grigori Saghyan, is that the right pronunciation? Internet Society Armenia. Many of you over there. We'll start with 55 to 62 minutes of speech by Thomas. 65, oh, you extended it, okay. But before that, I want to just throw it to you, and firstly to every one of you, and then all of you there. One word, just one word, that comes to your mind first when we mention multi-stakeholder. One word. How do you explain it with one word?
Messy. 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 It's messy.
Messy. That's interesting. Collaboration. One word.
Buzzword.
Buzzword. I mentioned that. No, I mentioned.
I have it in my speech. I wrote it before you said it. So.
Process.
Process.
Cooperation.
Cooperation. We had it twice, huh? Cooperation. No, it was collaboration and cooperation. Anyone, just throw the word. Curiosity. Dialogue. Which one? Utopian. Okay. Trust. Trust. Awareness. Huh. Power sharing. That's interesting. Okay. I think it gives you a good idea where we are now. Do you still want to have your 65 minutes, or it seems like people
67.
get it? But people get it now. Thomas, floor is
I
yours.
tried to take not more than 10 hours for my introduction. So when I actually wrote my notes this morning, so the first bullet point says, since WSIS multi-stakeholder model, or multi-stakeholder has become the buzzword in the IG debate. So I won't expand on this. The question is, what does this multi-stakeholder model actually mean? ICANN used to say until recently, we are the multi-stakeholder model. They changed that, luckily. But is there something like the multi-stakeholder model? Of course not. There are several different types or versions of that model, almost as many as people speak about it. The commonality, and it has been mentioned here, of all multi-stakeholder models are, or at least should be, that multiple stakeholders work together on something, discuss things, and maybe even take decisions together. But I have to disagree with Vlada. Multi-stakeholder approach is not new to WSIS. It has actually existed for years and decades and centuries before. You have multi-stakeholder models in the UN, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which is dealing with labor issues, is working with employers, employees, and governments on rules and principles for labor rights and so on. The ITU has had sector members, I don't know since when, but they participate in 150 years. That's the ITU. I don't know whether the sector members existed there, but for decades at least, they participate in study groups. They are also allowed to sit in the back in the plenipotentiary conferences. So there is a different grades of the multi-stakeholder model. In intergovernmental organizations, usually stakeholders are included up to a certain point, and then when it comes to decision-making, the governments are left by themselves. Same goes for the WSIS process. There was a large inclusion of stakeholders, but not in the final drafting of the document. So to me, really, the multi-stakeholder model is about inclusion of all stakeholders to different degrees depending on different processes, which is nothing new. So what is new and special about the multi-stakeholder model in internet governance? First of all, one thing that is special is that the internet has not been developed by lawyers or public servants, but by technicians. And lawyers and public servants didn't even know that the internet exists for quite a long time. So that shifts the power in the beginning compared to other areas where this has not been the case. Some people say that in internet governance, the multi-stakeholder model should only be called multi-stakeholder model if it treats all stakeholders on equal level, if they have equal powers. This is the case in some areas and processes, but not in others. If you look at ICANN, for instance, you have governments that are included, but the decision-making power is with the board, which is a private entity. It's individual people that take decisions on behalf or in the best interests of the community. This is according to their bylaws. In IGOs, as I said, you have more and more open and inclusive debates, but the decision-making is with governments. The only place where you have all stakeholders on equal level is the IGF and EuroDig and some of the other IGF structures, but there no decisions are taken, it's just a dialogue, so that's the easiest part to have everybody on equal level. A first attempt to go a step further was the Net Mundial conference organized by the Brazilian government and ICANN last year, where a document was drafted with all stakeholders on equal level. Those who were there may remember that we were all standing behind microphones on equal floor, governments and the rest of the world. However, these processes are new, they are not fully clear. People criticize that Net Mundial hasn't been fully transparent, fully inclusive, which is true, but it's the first time that something like this had been done. And we are also trying to do something similar here for the global IGF. There's also work about an outcome document has started, and so this is not going to be the last. Net Mundial hasn't been the last time where something like this has been tried. There are some challenges with the multi-stakeholder approach. Less when it's only about dialogue, but more when it's about decision-making. One is, of course, the legitimacy of those that participate. Who do you represent? Is the representation balanced? If it's a consensus decision, then this is not so relevant because everybody needs to agree. What if people can vote? What if the ICANN community can vote on the new proposal for the IANA? How are these votes balanced and weighed? So how do you make sure that the outcome of a multi-stakeholder process is not captured by special interests? And even though a process may be open and inclusive in theory, that doesn't mean that there are no barriers in real life to actually participate. If you don't have the money, the resources, if you don't have the time to participate in 15 conference calls a day, you may not be able to have your views represented, or your needs there may be language barriers, cultural barriers, and so on and so forth. So how do we concretely organize a multi-stakeholder process that is perceived as fair, as representative, and the outcome has a legitimacy in this regard? The only way is that we will need to develop minimal standards, or you may call it safeguards, that guarantee some balance of access, of inclusion, and of a possibility to participate in a multi-stakeholder process. However, there are some people, especially from the technical community, that say there should be no rules at all. Multi-stakeholder model should just be open. It should be anarchy. No rules, no governments. You know this debate about code is law and blah, blah, blah. The problem with anarchy is that it may be great for brainstorming, for getting new ideas in, but when it comes to decision makings, as soon as money and power is involved, there will automatically rules will evolve automatically. And if there is no safeguards or guidance that are perceived as fair or just or balanced, then the strongest players will define the rules, and the weaker ones and the absent ones will be ignored. And if such a multi-stakeholder model means that it is Wild West, where the strongest ones win and the others lose, then this is not what I or also my government, which I work for, would be in favor of. So we need to make sure that all members of the community can make their voice heard in a multi-stakeholder process, including in particular the vulnerable groups. And we need to make sure that the multi-stakeholder model creates outcomes that make sure that decisions are not in favor of small groups of a chosen few, but in the interest, to the extent possible, of the whole community. So we need the multi-stakeholder model to have all members of our community represented and heard. The question is, this is again nothing new. Why shouldn't this be done by parliaments, our governments, and our traditional governance models? This is why we created them after kings have been expelled from countries a few centuries ago. The problem is that experience has shown that the traditional governance models do not fully live up to these expectations of inclusiveness and balanced representation either. So if the multi-stakeholder model is contributing to enhancing inclusiveness and transparency and access to decision making, then of course this is a step ahead in the right direction. But again, this is not so easy because the rules for a multi-stakeholder decision-making processes are not mostly, if there are such processes, they are not clearly defined. And a good example is what is going on currently in ICANN is the process to find a new model for the IANA oversight, and in particular for enhancing ICANN's accountability. And there are fundamental issues discussed in a very short time frame, and people are striving to follow, to understand, to bring their views in, and to somehow feel integrated. Although the process is formally open, remarkably open, everything is put on the table, in reality this is not so easy. But of course we are not starting from scratch. As I said, we have a number of existing models and long existing models that have developed some mechanisms to guarantee a minimum of inclusion, transparency, and safeguard from capture by special interests. To give you one example from my country, we have also a traditional governance system with a parliament, a government, and an administration, and so on. But we have an element that is making it quite different compared to most others. In our system, citizens can challenge any decision that the parliament or the government makes. We have popular votes in 10 days where we will vote on a change in the funding structure of our public service broadcaster. We can say yes or no to a proposal for an inheritance tax, subsidies for students. I will spare you the details. So whatever the parliament or the government decides, this is up for scrutiny by the people. This does not only have the effect that if the people say no, that they will have to come up with another proposal, but it has the effect that because they know that any decision that they do can be challenged, they have an interest in developing something where at least they hope that this will be acceptable by the people, by the citizens, because if not, they have to do the work again, which is not very efficient. So in addition to the actual result of a vote, the mere possibility that you could vote and say no is having a controlling effect on those in power, that they try to do something that is actually what the people want. And this brings me to something that has been mentioned, I think, by Oksana, the element of trust and control. In any governance model, in particular also in the multi-stakeholder model, where the rules are not that clear, it is essential to be able to trust the model, be able to trust the decision-making processes, to trust the people. But in order to be able to trust, you need to somehow have the feeling that you can control them, and if they ignore you, you have means to tell them that they ignore you and to maybe change the decision. So I would like to end with this by saying that only if decision makers and decision preparers know that they will be held accountable and controlled by the community, they have an interest in not taking decisions for special interests, but actually for those that they are accountable to. And no matter whether you call it a traditional governance model or you call it a multi-stakeholder model, if there's no elements of checks and balances, of control, then the model will not produce the outcome that people expect. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. You have 55 more minutes. Two things that I have in mind when you mentioned that. First one is when you were talking about the global level of kind of policy making. And you're talking about this also another buzzword which is called equal footing. How do we make all the stakeholders on equal footing? Can we make them all be on equal footing? Still someone has to bring a decision. The examples of ICANN and probably other IGF as well show that decisions are not necessarily policy papers. They're not necessarily hard decisions in the way we learned. But there might be soft policies and initiatives and so on which might be helpful. So a short reflection on that. And the second one is you mentioned we have to make sure that we include everyone. Where do you stop? How do you involve everyone? Where is it? I mean, where do you draw a limit and line and say, okay, this is enough. We can't involve every single citizen or organization.
No, you don't stop. You have to involve every single citizen and organization. The problem is if there are too many, you need to somehow develop representation mechanisms. But again, they need to be transparent, accountable, and so on and so forth. This is what we have done 200 years back in France, in the UK, and elsewhere, where they, as I said, introduce parliaments. If we use the multi-stakeholder model as a basis, we will somehow need to develop if it's about decision making and not in a consensus, but maybe on a voting basis if people do not agree, but you need to take a decision. You need to develop representation mechanisms, and they will not depend on political or geographical origins. They may depend on stakeholder groups that will then need to develop their own representational mechanisms within themselves. There were some elements of this in the WISIS with the civil society family bureaus. There were 20 families, so there are some ways. But if you want to be inclusive, you will need to activity in one way or another. Otherwise, it's not inclusive in the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we had a number of examples when it comes to representativity of the civil society, especially. How do you actually organize civil society and non-government organizations in a kind of mechanism that can be, in a way, legitimate and provide legitimate representation? But we'll get back to that. We're trying to zoom in a way. We were on a global level now, and Thomas gave a general perspective of IGF, ICANN, ITU, and international organizations. We're zooming in now to the European level. So, Megan, when it comes to the European Commission, and when it comes to all the different policies and well, even decisions that you make on a level of European Commission, how does multi-stakeholder model work in practice? There, does it work?
You want me to go beyond internet governance? Well,
with some
there's a wonderful homily which is attributed to Bismarck, but in fact it wasn't Bismarck who said it, which is, you should never watch legislation or sausages being made. And I think that internet governance is a bit like that. That's why I said messy. It's not a criticism or to say that messy is bad, but by its very nature, it requires a lot of effort. It requires everyone to contribute. The outcome is not always immediately clear. The input is not always immediately clear. It's not always clear who is doing what, under what circumstances, etc. So that's a sort of general overview of internet governance at the global level, and that, of course, extends also to the European level. And in Europe, also, we have a very interesting framework for legislation, as many of you probably know. You don't want me to tell you. It's really worse than sausage making. But as you know, the Commission makes proposals for legislation. The Council and the Parliament take decisions. So this also involves a lot of consultation with the public. By definition, everything that the Commission does in terms of proposing legislation or policy changes, by definition goes to an impact assessment. It has a public consultation. That means the entire interested community, wherever it may be, can comment on it. And I think this is very useful. As I said earlier, it doesn't mean that because X has insisted on something that will necessarily be the result, but it has to be taken into consideration. So all things have to be taken into consideration. And in the internet governance sphere, I think it's a very interesting one because we don't have one single internet governance. We always talk about internet governance as if it's one element, but it's like the internet. The internet itself is a network of networks. It works on different layers. Different actors have different roles and different influences. Governments have an important role. The technical community has an important role. But again, it depends on where in those layers and where in those networks your influence should be and how it should apply. In the area of internet protocols, for example, the technical community has an extremely important role. They're the ones who know how it works. They've been working on this for many years. It doesn't mean that there should be no consideration of public policy issues, not at all. Those elements have to be taken into consideration to the extent and as far as they can be done. Now, in the context of European internet governance per se, we spend a lot of time, and we should spend more. It's not at all perfect. Nothing is perfect in a messy situation like this, but we should spend a lot more time, and we would like to spend more time, but we spend as much time as we have been able to date in consulting civil society, in consulting industry, in consulting governments on what European positions should be with respect to issues in the internet governance sphere. For example, prior to this meeting, not this specific one, the Southeastern Europe one, but Eurodig itself, we had a consultation with European civil society and European industry to make sure that we had heard their voice. Now, obviously, we didn't consult every single European industrial representative or every single civil society participant in Europe, but to the extent possible. The information was out there, we had remote participation, so by all means it's not perfect. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's perfect or wonderful, but we do try, and I think this is an important element, to try to expand that, to make sure that to the extent possible we hear the voices and hear the issues that arise. Now, also again, to qualify my messy adjective, we all recognize how complex and complicated it is, the whole internet governance field, both at international level, at multi-stakeholder level, at national level, at regional level, etc. And so one of the things that the Commission is trying to do is roll out something called the Global Internet Policy Observatory, which is a tool that will help stakeholders who don't usually have access either to money, time, access to information about internet governance, to help them to participate more actively, to know what's going on, to try to bring into a single platform information about what's happening, to help those weaker stakeholders to have more of a say and at least to be aware of what's going on. It's really very complex. There are, as I said, many different layers and many different elements to be taken into consideration. So sometimes it feels as though it's all a bit too much. And if you followed the IANA transition and IANA accountability, ICANN accountability discussions, you will feel completely overwhelmed just because of the volume of emails and messages. And some of us have been involved in that. And again, another thing I wanted to mention, which Thomas raised, is ICANN itself. This is only one part of internet governance, and I'm sure Thomas would agree with me. There are many other elements of internet governance that relate to other aspects and are very important. And also, I think it's not entirely correct to say that the internet was established only by technicians. It was effectively paid for entirely by the American government initially under the DARPA program, the DARPANet. That was the initial start of what was the internet. And then, of course, CERN, through Tim Berners-Lee, developed the World Wide Net, which was, again, through a public organization and public funding. He did it sort of in his coffee time and in the evenings, of course. But this is what really helped to bring the internet to the stage that we know now and allow us all to use it. So the public contribution has been also very important in this. So I don't want to spend too much time because I'm sure there are lots of interesting comments from the crowd.
Thank you, Megan. What resonates is that the messy concept of multi-stakeholderism or multi-stakeholder concept is quite well understood already in Europe, but not in this part of the world, and we really like messy things. So that's something wrong here. There's something really wrong here. But okay, I got the point that when it comes to European Commission, multi-stakeholder model does not end on the level of having people in the back of the room, as we heard about some of the the international organizations still. But I want to get a very practical response from you now. You came here, I suppose, to talk to people, listen to discussions, what else? When you get back home to Brussels, how do you utilize this multi-stakeholder discussion in the policy-making process in Brussels?
Into the mic, this one. That's a tricky question. Well, I mean, obviously, this year, and I don't want to dominate the conversation because I think many others have things to say, but this year is a particularly important year for internet governance. We have a whole series of very important things going on. We have the IANA supervision transition, which is very important. It will have all sorts of implications. We have the ICANN accountability process going on in parallel. The NTIA, which is the agency of the Department of Commerce in the United States, has a contract with ICANN to manage the IANA function, which ends, for the time being, on 30th of September this year. This whole process will be very important because, as it's quite clear, this contract will have to be extended in some way and in some form after the 30th of September because the multi-stakeholder community is not yet ready with a final proposal that would be accepted by the American political elements, let's say, or establishment, that's perhaps the better word, by the 30th of September. So that's clear. So what will this mean for all sorts of other events and activities going on this year? We have the WSIS Plus 10 review this year. In the context of the WSIS Plus 10 review, we want to have an extension of the mandate of the Internet Governance Forum. You are an important contribution to the Internet Governance Forum and all the activities and the discussions that take place there. Marcus, who was on the previous panel, is one of the founders of the Internet Governance Forum, the head of the Secretariat for many years, and a very important participant. So these elements are all very important to bring forward into the European discussion. Quite frankly, on a sort of superficial overall position or view, Europe has been entirely consistent and coherent and has agreed that the multi-stakeholder model is the right solution. The European Commission has always said that, the Parliament has always said that, the Council has always said that, the Member States always say this. Now, as I said, it means slightly different things to slightly different people in slightly different circumstances, etc., etc. But the basic principle everyone agrees on. So, to the extent we have elements that are important to bring into that conversation and into that discussion, of course, we bring all that forward into the discussions we have with civil society, with industry, with the Parliament, with the Council, etc., in Brussels and elsewhere as well.
So that means, back to the practical question, you get the inputs out of here and kind of send them to Brussels when it comes to decision making, or wow.
Yeah, we try to make our voice, we try to make your voice heard, but this is also your responsibility. So we hope and expect that when you go back to your capitals or go back to your corporation or your civil society organization or wherever you've come from, you will pass on the messages that you have had. That's one of the most important things about all these discussions, that everyone hears the voices of others, they hear what's important to each other, and they're able to assess and review those issues and send the message back.
Thanks. I made a big omission at the beginning. I didn't present our rapporteur, Anna Kakalashvili, who is writing hard here to pick up all the notes and present them at the end. And then the remote moderator, Matei-Eugen Vasile, who is helping us with the remote participation. We have 4 people, right? 4 people now. Any comments or questions from the remote? Okay, let us know. Any direct comments or questions from your side at the moment? We'll open up later. Just maybe 2 short comments. Present yourself, please. Introduce yourself.
My name is Zoran Ivančić from CPI Foundation from Sarajevo. I will make it short, but there are several. What worries me at the beginning of the comments of Mr. Schneider explaining international governance mechanism, multi-stakeholder, mentioning ILO and UN bodies, and etc. It usually doesn't work, or when great crises arise, it doesn't work. UN agencies are not, ILO is losing power, International Labour Organization. So it's not something that can solve serious and acute problems. Other thing I wanted to ask is direct democracy is also subject to populism. So if you want a large number of people, like referendum in Switzerland about building mosques without minarets and stuff like that. So it's not, again, it's not, I understand that problems has to be observed and solved by different tools and watching from different angles. And I wonder, why did you miss to mention TTIP? Because TTIP is also very relevant for internet rights and internet governments. And is EU neutral to this? Are you able to confront these ideas? These ideas are not announced or public. Are you quietly observing what TTIP will do?
Just explain the acronym.
TTIP is
Transatlantic.
Transatlantic, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll keep these questions, so write them down. We have another comment somewhere over there.
Thank you. I am Jon Thorhalsson. I'm the president of SECO, the Confederation of European Computer User Association. And I have one question for Megan. There has been criticism that the European Commission is not paying enough attention to the Internet and to the development of the Internet governance. That it is slow in reacting and sort of stays on the sidelines. Maybe you would comment on that.
Thank you. Okay, what I get from here is one of the additional risks of the multi-stakeholder model is that it possibly doesn't really work always within the intergovernmental organization or international organization in some cases. And we can get back to that at some point, but I think what's important, more important, is to focus on can it work in internet governance and what are the practical examples of work or doesn't work in internet governance. The second one is the risk of populism. That is one of the obstacles or risks when it comes to multi-stakeholder model. And then we have the questions for Megan. I don't know, Megan, if you want, because those are probably the two direct questions. Then we'll get back throughout discussion to the other two, a tweet or two in response to this.
Okay, now I'm going to be like Thomas, taking 65 minutes of the time. I feel bad. But, well, on the last question, which was about the role of the European Commission, the European Commission is also part of the multi-stakeholder approach. So we're not the only voice. And quite frankly, I think that the Commission has taken quite an active role in internet governance, both politically and administratively and morally, by supporting Eurodig, by supporting the IGF. We have been very active and important funders of the IGF Secretariat, for example, have been encouraging the multi-stakeholder approach and the multi-stakeholder model. The new Commissioner for Digital Economy and Society, Günther Oettinger, is going to speak tomorrow in a video presentation on internet governance to Eurodig. He's very interested in this. He was at the WSIS Forum last week in Geneva, meeting all sorts of world leaders to discuss internet governance, the importance of it. Vice President Ansip, of course, has taken also a particular interest. He's the Vice President of the European Commission responsible for the digital single market. And of course, as you can imagine, to have a digital single market, we need a good, strong, resilient, open, safe internet. So he has a particular interest in internet governance and making sure that it works. But again, it's not up to the Commission to take one single position. We have to work with the member states, we have to work with Parliament, etc. So we try to coordinate and, to the extent possible, move forward in this area in terms of improvement on multi-stakeholder model, the way in which Europe's voice can be better presented. I mentioned JIPO, this Global Internet Policy Observatory, which will help to bring more participants in, etc. So that's on the Commission participation and action. And then on TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Program, I think it's called. Partnership. Pardon? Partnership, yeah, of course, partnership. The P is always throw me. Well, of course, data flows are one of the issues that are being discussed in this. And it's a bit unusual to say that the Commission is not active, because the Commission is representing the trade, external trade. It's part of the Lisbon Treaty, that, and in fact before, that trade is one of the competences of the European Union. So as representative of the Union, the Commission acts as the trade negotiator with the United States on TTIP. So it's not our department, but the Commission is extremely active in that. So those issues, the digital issues, are also contributed by us into the conversation and into the discussion.
So on the first one, the summary is messy. On the second one, the summary is you learned something, and the Commission learned something from the ACTA. So that's good. Okay, let's move. That was a provocation. No, I said it. Okay, we're moving on to the second part, which is again zooming into a national level, and that's where I hope we can hear also more from you. How does this system, does it work on a national level? Before I move on to the panelists, I see that tweets are very active. So those of you that are here and those of you that are watching remotely, I challenge you to write the way, or tweet the way you translate multi-stakeholder in your language, including the translation of the way you say it. That'll be interesting, and I think Anna can probably pick up some of the translation that might show on Twitter, so that we see how many languages actually in Southeastern Europe, how many countries actually have a more or less solid translation of the word multi-stakeholder in a national language, and how does that sound? What does it say? I know that some of you will mention it in the next turns. Megan, you wanted to?
Just on the translation issue, I mean, there are many ways of skinning a cat, as we say in English, a very bad expression. But there are translations into the 24 EU languages. I know that doesn't cover everyone in Southeastern Europe, but many of you can still understand Croat or Slovenian, etc., etc. Of multi-stakeholder, we use multi-stakeholder approach, multi-stakeholderism, internet governance. All those are translated, perhaps not perfectly, but there are official translations of all those terms. So I would suggest you look at those in the translations of official documents that exist, and if they don't suit or they're not the right, then by all means send a message and we tell the translators to use a different term.
Thank you for this very practical and very useful, and so chance to feedback to the Commission and change if we don't agree with that. We start with a Bulgarian host, Hristov. Bulgaria, how does it work? Is there a multi-stakeholder system in a way, to some extent, when it comes to digital policies and internet governance? How does it work?
Thank you. First, I would like to express my great pleasure and honor of the fact that Sofia was chosen to host the annual meeting of EuroDIC. Yes, thank you very much. Under overarching theme, shaping the internet together, and the Ministry of Transport, Information Technology and Communications as an institutional partner for its conduction. The topic about the national understanding of multi-stakeholder model. In Bulgaria, the Ministry of Transport, Information Technology and Communications is a state authority that is committed to making the national policy in the field of ICT and internet, including internet governance. In order to achieve complete transparency and awareness in the implementation of these functions, the Ministry maintains permanent effective collaboration with the main players in the field of ICT and the internet. In Bulgaria, a number of authorities and organizations are committed to various aspects of internet and its governance in particular. The most important of these players are our Ministry, Internet Society Bulgaria, the BG Registry, Unicard, Bulgaria Web Association, Foundation Law and Internet, Foundation Applied Research and Communications, Bulgarian Research and Education Network, the Academia, the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, the industry and the ICT sector. Almost all the participants involved in the process have a specific role and sphere of action, allowing complement of an overall picture. The proactive participation of the government in the process is linking to its leading role in the development and implementation of public policies. The Ministry is committed to supporting capacity building within the dialogue among all stakeholders, as well as creating opportunities to organize active public consultations and conduct activities for the development of public policy as a shared responsibility. In the past year, we also signed a cooperation agreement with the Internet Corporation for assigned names and numbers, ICANN, which provided common actions regarding the management of Internet names in Europe and the training of Bulgarian experts in Internet governance. The first joint event was also conducted in Sofia, dedicated to cybersecurity issues, with the participation of Mr. John Crane from the ICANN. This mutual completion of roles is important, but not as much as achieving the synergies and synchronization between the actors that are necessary to achieve higher efficiency of their activities. This is the great ambition of the Ministry to provide the necessary environment to actively implement the multi-stakeholder model of fruitful collaboration while also achieve full transparency and awareness. In order to achieve the necessary requirements, a public expert council was established to the Minister of Transport, Information Technology and Communications, which includes representatives of all stakeholders. A good example of this fruitful collaboration is the national high-level domain in Cyrillic. The proposal of the string was submitted only after conducting extensive consultations and roundtables with representatives of all stakeholders, followed by a public discussion. After the proposal was approved by the ICANN, preparation began for conducting the delegation procedure in accordance to the rules of the Internet Assigned Number Authority, IANA. The documents developed in relation to the selection of a candidate to build and administrate the top-level domain registry in Cyrillic, apart from being a subject matter of a public consultation on the website of the Ministry, are also discussed on the e-democracy electronic platform. Then they shall be adopted by the Public Expert Council. This information about our efforts to implement the multi-stakeholder model in the internet governance in Bulgaria.
Thank you, Hristo. Just, well, first, thanks for being the host of the EuroDig. I think this is one of the greatest examples of support to multi-stakeholder model and dialogue. It struck me the Public Expert Council to the Ministry that you mentioned. To what extent this council is really consulted? It's not just kind of we tick the box, we have a council, but to what extent the council and the experts are really involved in policy shaping when it comes to digital policies?
So the process of decision making is one of the tasks of this council. All the documents produced by the working groups with the participation of all stakeholders must have the sanction of this council, also with the participation of these stakeholders. I think that all opinions are taken in account in this case.
Thank you. That's probably something we, from the other countries, can look into as an example. Thank you. Let's move on to Serbia. So we had a ministry here from Bulgaria. Now we have the registry of the domain names. Dušan, Serbian case is, I would say, interesting when it comes to multi-stakeholder approach. How would you describe it?
Maybe. I am coming from a multi-stakeholder model organization, and I don't want to speak about organization itself. I want to talk about history of Serbia, because you have laws here in Bulgaria. I heard that you have some laws upon multi-stakeholder model. I don't know. Maybe I am wrong. But back in Serbia, we do not have any laws, anything that will handle this kind of model. So, but we have a history. How many of you knows about Josip Broz Tito? Yes, this is Southeastern Europe. Okay. So, you know, back in those days, my head is gray, so I must talk about history. Back in those days, we were living in one system. Western will say communist, but for us it was slightly different than in Bulgaria, than in Russia, than in other Eastern Bloc countries. Tito developed one system called self-managing system. What is the true meaning of this system? Workers in factories, organization, and everything was at the same time the owners of this organization, factory, or something like that. So the basic thing here is this bottom-up approach. We live that. We know how to build multi-stakeholder model without any laws. Something is wrong here. Okay. Because of so we have okay. I'm coming, as I said, I'm coming from multi-stakeholder organization. We was formed back in, I think, 2007 or 6. So it's been quite a while we are doing this multi-stakeholder thing in Serbia, and I could tell you the stories, but I would like to hear from you. What are you thinking about, for example, multi-stakeholder model? Multi-stakeholder model, for me, there is a meaning that there is one model, or two models, or three models, but this is a process. You can build. This is not a model like we have something and we implement it. We cannot implement a multi-stakeholder model in every country. We cannot implement in every culture this. There is a culture issues, there is a governmental issues and other issues. So in Serbia, we didn't have cultural issues and everything. We had governmental issues, but luckily for us, we had government who tolerate us, and we are in collaboration now with the government, and there is no hard feelings about top-down and bottom-up approaches between the government and us. But we must learn from them, they must learn from us. This is from my point of view from Serbian registry.
So it gets even more interesting here. Not only the messy thing are not really interesting here, but even we have a background of samoupravljanje and self-governance, or whatever we would put it in a translation, but still it seems like we're missing the national multi-stakeholder models. I want to hear really, now back to the present or future, if you wish, how does the RNIDS model, the model of the Serbian registry, which is to a large extent involving other stakeholders, how does it work, at least on the level of decisions related to the Serbian domains?
First of all, we had this line, we have a General Assembly, and we try to have all the stakeholders in this General Assembly. General Assembly, if you want to talk about the model, they elect Board of Governors, and Board of Governors will elect workers or administration. We have a small office of something 10 people working the technical job about CCTLD. But every decision of Board of Governance or General Assembly itself back to all stakeholders. Also, government, they are included through some organizations in our General Assembly, but we have, and we are right now in the process of government are judging our model, how it is. Does we include every stakeholder? Does we do the job properly? Even on the technical level, we had penetration tests. We have limits for these technical things. First, we must have all stakeholders in Serbia involved in this model. After that, we build processes. That's why I said process.
Thanks. The reason why I raised this is because, okay, even though the focus of your work is the domains, the concept of having the kind of the assembly where you actually bring anyone who is interesting is the concept, the practical model of multi-stakeholder approach in a way. And that's something in a previous session, I think Marcus or Jean-Jacques who mentioned the example of CGI, the Brazilian manager of domains, who is at the same time actually kind of a public expert council voice when it comes to building digital policies in Brazil. So that's an interesting example. I wanted to hear more about the Serbian. That's the reason. Wolf wanted to jump in with a question. Wolf.
Wolf Ludwig. What I understood from previous discussions we had, Dušan, was one of the success factors of your model was you didn't ask anybody for permission. You just did it. And this, in my opinion, is one of the most exciting components of the multi-stakeholder model. You do not wait for any government, for any approval, for any authority or whatsoever. When you think technical community, civil society, business in many cases, it makes sense, it should be done, you simply do it. And I think this is a particularity and one of the most sexiest elements of the multi-stakeholder model.
Thank
Yes,
you, Wolf. It boils to the point that you mentioned that there is no law which defines
Yes.
multi-stakeholder.
There is no law on domain names at all in Serbia also. So back in 2006, 30 organizations involved in domain business get together to solve the problem because the government didn't want to solve the problem, form something. So we solved the problem. Building this organization, expanding it, and so on and so on. This is the history. And this is connecting with this Josip Broz Tito thing. We have this in our heads.
You are the old generation, Dušan. You are the old generation.
Yes, I know my gray hair.
Now, a very concrete example when you mentioned that you don't really have to ask anyone is this space. This space emerged 2008, right? Starting from a cafe discussion. I'm not going to go into details on that, but it was a couple of people that sit down together for beer, I think it was, and starting a discussion, we should try to do something on the European level like what we have on a global level. And look at where we are now, with all the support of the governments as well, involvement of governments, of the Commission and many others. And I would like to hear also if there is such a case in your countries. But before that, microphone over to Grigori.
Vlada, just
yeah,
to jump in,
sure.
this is not beer dig, this is SEEDIG.
As one of our colleagues recently, the Wussis mentioned, I think the Swiss even, the great importance of beer-to-beer communication. Grigori, how do things work in Armenia? And now we have a civil society. We had government and technical community, civil society. Well, ISOC is technical community.
Technical
in a way as
community
well,
also,
right.
yes.
Right.
Sometimes government.
So you have a lot of hats, huh?
Thank you. I want to say about our practical model with description what we have done in Armenia during these 3 years, before, which was the long process to create our vision of to implement our vision of the multi-stakeholder model. In brief, it was established in last year, in August 24. Formally it was established and includes representatives from government, private and public sector, technical community, academia. I will tell the list after the presentation, if you will want. The status of this council, Internet Governance Council, is interdepartmental commission with invited members from non-governmental organization. So it was a decision to create interdepartmental governmental commission and invite members. So this is very important to note. The head of the council is the Deputy Minister of Transport and Communications, which is responsible for telecommunications. The secretary of this council is Vice Chair of Internet Site of Armenia. It's me. I'm the council secretary of Internet Governance Council. The secretariat of this IGC is Internet Society of Armenia. All appointments for this council were done by Prime Minister of Armenia. Of course, we have prepared all necessary documents, but formally these positions were appointed by the Prime Minister. Council is acting according to Internet governance principles, which are similar with, which are common for Internet ecosystem, which we have in Internet Society, in all main documents, which we have in the in Internet ecosystem. Council have developed an action plan for 5 years. Among actions there are IPv6, DNSSEC implementation, support for local internet exchanges, development of child online protection strategy, how to implement netiquette rules, complete information about action plan, as well as about IGC in general, possible to find on igc.am site. You can find their IGC bylaws, member list, principles, minutes of the meetings, resolutions in 3 languages, in Armenian, English and Russian. Mrs. Liana Galesyan, who is present here, is responsible for maintaining this website. I want to say that IGC is an advisory body. It is a structure which looks like CGI-BR, but CGI-BR was created many years ago. I think that creation of such structures in various countries establish the cooperation between these structures will help for further development of global multi-stakeholder community. This is in brief about situation. It's not utopia, by the way. It's a real working structure, okay? So what kind of problems we had before creation? First, main problem, I think is common for other countries. Multi-stakeholder approach was announced on WSIS in 2005, and 47 leaders of states had put their signatures. But it was not a convention, it was not a bilateral or multilateral agreement, and governmental employees, they don't have any interest to implement this decision, because nobody pushed them. It's just a declaration. It was a declaration. I can say more. There was a resistance. No governmental employees, they don't want to take additional functions on them. Yes, it's a problem. Second, necessary to understand what kind of organizational structure you must have. In our case, it's an interdepartmental commission. Because today, legally, it's very hard to combine in one place government, public sector, private sector, technical community. So the more or less acceptable solution is such commission, which is advisory body. Also, there we had a problem with identification. Which governmental structure will be our main partner? In some countries, it's Ministry of Economy. In some countries, it's separate department, IT department. In some countries, it's regulator. In our case, we decided that Ministry of Transport and Communication is more closer with the structure because, you know, it's a Ministry of Communication is representative of ITU. Okay, it's linked with ITU, and ITU is very active in WSIS process. So, you know. Very important to have good personal relations with governmental structures because trust and confidence, without trust and confidence, it's impossible to create real working structure. In general, serious problem is bureaucracy, you know. Governments are working very slow, but it's possible to wait. Okay. So, and very important sustainability. In our case, who will provide the uninterruptible working process for this IGC? In our case, it is the Internet Society of Armenia, which is responsible for .am, country code, top-level domain. And we have more or less, not so much, but we have some kind of funding to provide this working process, working flow. So that's in brief about situation about Armenia.
Thank you, Grigori. Very, very interesting. I'll use what Dušan started with. Get back to the past. How did you come up to this? How did this happen?
I see. It was happened because in 2012 there was ITU conference on ITRs, Internet Telecom Regulation. And because in order to prepare position of Armenia on this ITR, we have received from ITU an official document with proposals from various countries what to do, how to give the control of on the internet to ITU. A lot of countries were trying to push the control on the internet to the ITU, but there was WSIS, which was in 2005 with multi-stakeholder model. And Ministry of Transport and Communication sent us to ISOC because we have an agreement of cooperation between ISOC and the ministry to give our expertise about these proposals. We, of course, prepared the model that it's necessary to have multi-stakeholder model, and we don't agree to give all rights to the ITU. Ministry have accepted our proposals and circulate them among other governmental structures. Of course, they have created their feedback, and after that, we obtained that we have a document with the internet governance principles, which were against the unique role of ITU on internet governance. So after that, it was more easy to implement this document on governmental level.
Thank you. Well, yeah, it seems like that the crisis or crisis event is something that can push the things, so the messages don't waste the crisis, right?
Yeah, you are right.
Don't waste the crisis. Okay, let me get back to you now. We had three national examples. I know that there is a Croatian IGF going on from recently. I know that there are some discussions that there is something happening in Serbia from time to time. There is something happening in Slovenia, Romania. I would like to hear briefly from some of you what's happening in your countries. Is there a model? And also, what do you see as the obstacles? Should I use Sorina's case? If no one raises the hand, I'll go around and I'll pass the microphone. Anyone from Romania? I'm looking at you.
The answer is no. Nothing is happening. No, really. I mean, it's like I'm struggling right now. We just saw that the national TLD has come up with a plan yesterday to insert some IDNs with no public procedure, with no discussions, and now we're trying to see, because they said they reserved a number of domain names for public administration, and trying to see how many they are, how long they are. So nothing is happening. Thank you. I think the main obstacle is for the public authorities to understand that the multi-stakeholder system means that they don't need to control it, and that they need to accept other parties, especially civil society, to stay on the same table and with the same level of discussion. And unless you understand that, you cannot have a dialogue.
Thanks.
May
Megan, yeah,
I
sure.
add a positive element from Romania, and perhaps not specific to the domain name system, but as far as I understand, and the Romanians in the room can clarify, my understanding is, and one of the areas that we're very interested in European Commission and the Union, of course, is digital skills. And this is a real problem in Europe because we don't have enough digital skills to go around to meet the demand for jobs. So one of the things we've been looking at is making sure in a multi-stakeholder context we bring industry, education, civil society, governments, job holders, job agencies, etc., all together to make sure that we create the right environment and develop these skills. And my understanding is that in Romania, the Ministry of Education has been extremely active in this area, in working with industry, in changing the curriculum. You're looking negative. But so my understanding is that Romania has been a very good example of this, to sort of transform the way the education system has worked, to create this kind of, these kinds of jobs, and to create the digital skills, perhaps not perfect, and not meeting all the requirements, but this is one area which is a positive aspect of multi-stakeholder.
I'm not sure if I should give you the microphone. I'm kidding.
I will not reply to your question, but I would leave someone from Romania that works at the Polytechnical University and actually teaches students digital skills that you all need to answer that.
Okay. Yeah, hello. So I'm Razvan. I'm from University Polytechnica Bucharest. It's kind of dreamy what I actually said. I haven't seen any of that. So it may have been said, but I'm working there, and from my point of view, of course, it's kind of subjective. If something positive happens, it's kind of a bottom-up approach, something like Dušan just mentioned happening. I haven't seen any sensible decision, from my point of view, coming up from the Ministry of Education. If it's happened because of some sort of degree of autonomy at university level and the faculty level where I'm part of. And I'm part of IT, I'm kind of going into IT, and all the collaboration is working quite well, and there's an entire boom within IT industry and people getting jobs and having very, very nice features, but it's mostly done by collaboration between the academia, the universities, and let's say the job market in the industry. And from my point of view, in spite of the Ministry of Education being there, if that wasn't there, it would have been the same. That's the way I see it. Sorry for spoiling it.
It works, that's important.
No, well, thank you. I mean, that is the point, to kind of honestly open up what's happening or what's not happening.
It's good, but it's because of the people, not because of the government or anything.
Don't get me wrong, I'm sorry to come back again. I wasn't suggesting that the government was driving this process forward. I was suggesting that this is a good example of multi-stakeholder where everyone works together. And maybe the good aspect in that case is the government doesn't interfere, is not as much involved as should be. So it's good. Huh?
Okay, we have a remote comment before, and then we'll move to Bosnia. It's your personal comment, sure. One line that I wanted to underline is that what Wolf said, some of the examples of the IGFs around the world emerged as a bottom-up, as a group of people sitting down in a cafe and coming up with an idea. The other set of IGFs emerged from top-down, but with a support and consultation of the society. So both models can work, probably some hybrid model as well. We don't have to stick to one or the other, but that's what we're listening to different cases. Sure.
So a follow-up to what Razvan was saying and your response to that. The problem is that his example, that's one of the few fortunate examples where they managed to do something very nice in spite of the government. But that's just an example. So don't take that as, okay, so the government is hands off, so everything is fine because of that. No, the government is not, most of the time it's not hands off. That's quite a corner case. So...
I guess it's a bit part with the IT industry, actually, because the IT industry is quite developed and you kind of get this.
Okay, let's move on. I promised the mic. I mean, we're taking notes of all of that, and one of those is probably the question to what extent the government should be involved in all of this, and should not, probably to the level of how constructive the government is, and if we have pioneers that understand the whole thing in the government. Let me move to Bosnia, and then we have two comments over there.
Okay, so first, just to say that when it's about Bosnia, multi-stakeholder can just be the level of governments we have. We have 14 of them. So to make them all coming together to talk is already a multi-stakeholder environment. I think I would start from sensible. There is nothing going on in Bosnia. Bosnia started very well in 2003, 2004, with strategy, paper, and so on, and then stopped. The only things that happened had been done by international community, UNDP at the face, then Electronic Southeast Europe initiative, but it was just a government stuff. We took 3 years to have the civil society having a seat, not a word, but just be there. What is happening now, there is I would say an emergent civil society that is not the traditional civil society. Those are the people of the internet, because they now have access, they have broadband, so they are interested in. And there is all these things about digital skills, startup and so on. But I think that the issue of governance cannot be solved in terms of skills. There are all these mechanisms, the EU and the Bosnians just started this long path toward accession somewhere. And what the progress report it's about jobs on information society. It's not about governance. I think that there is a need that certain things are on the agenda. And I believe that it can have to start bottom up, because people, as users, as citizens, will talk. There are the IT community and the academia is more and more active, but I don't think that our governments, even though there are people inside the institution that are willing to, I don't think that our governments in Bosnia and Herzegovina are ready to take the challenge to talk for the benefit of their own people.
Thank you. I think one of the points that you mentioned is very important to note. There are people in the governments. So it's important to find these people in the governments which are pioneers, which understand and see how we can help them to boost the whole process, if that is possible. We have a lady here and a gentleman.
Hello, I'm Saimia Thoci. I'm coming from Kosovo, governmental institution. All of these talking about international internet domain names, but Kosovo doesn't have domain names. I have a question because in my country we have a lot of legislation in ICT fields, infrastructure and application, but don't have internet domain names. My question for key participants is, how can we help to talk the internet domain names? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think we can probably keep this question for the session on icon and domain names, which is in the afternoon, but we'll note it definitely. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Panagiotis Papaspiliopoulos. I'm coming from Greece. Greece is also a part of the Southeastern Europe. It's in Balkans, so I can truly understand what the other people from other Balkan countries say. So what is the reality in Greece? The reality in Greece is that I'm working for the Ministry of Infrastructure, and I have met more people interested in internet governance, domain names, and the multi-stakeholder approach, the bottom-up approach inside the governmental institutions rather than the civil, the private sector and the academia. I would like very much to work closer together with people from the private sector and the academia. we don't have a Greek IGF. I would say that having an IDN, CCTLD will give us this opportunity to create such a platform. Taking this decision about which will be our application for the IDN CCTLD, it was a bottom-up process, kindly. And I would like to say that in the governmental level, in different levels, in the ministry where I belong, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, other ministries, the regulator, the registry, we are very active. Unfortunately, we had some other economical situation that they do not allow us to be more active. And maybe this is the reason why the people is not active at this last years. But as I said, I would like to see more involvement and more triggering to the government where there are people educated and willing to contribute from the private sector and from the academia. That is all I would like to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me remind you that the first Internet Governance Forum was actually in Athens in 2006, and it might be a good idea to have the EuroDig next year or some other years in Athens. We have about 5 more minutes before we then back to a wrap up. So I want from each one of you a tweet, a tweet message. Okay, Thomas, you can even get a short reflection because you were silent for more than you were assigned 62 minutes. So a brief reflection from you and then tweets from everyone.
Thank you. And actually this discussion shows very well that there is, in the traditional system, there is a mistrust towards the classical governance system. Many people say, my government doesn't do this, doesn't do that. And if the multi-stakeholder model, in whatever concrete form, helps to overcome this, then we are one step ahead towards self-determination of the people. And just to give a quick response to you, of course, the people can also take wrong decisions or egoistic decisions or populist decisions, also in my country where they can vote. But my experience is they do this less commonly than politicians, than parliamentarians, and other people do it because they have much more power and are much more inclined to abuse their power. And what you see here with governments, in my culture, and this is, Dušan is completely right, it's a cultural, the culture also shapes, needs to shape the way that the governance model needs to look like, because what works in my country, because we have a different history, may not work in another, and the other way around. In my culture, the notion of self-determination is fundamental to our governance system. This is why we built in all the elements of bottom-up control. But that doesn't mean self-determination without caring about your neighbor. So if you have the right to decide whether it's a classical model or a multi-stakeholder model, you also need to face the consequences. So if we vote for, we want to have a new school or we want to have a new road, we also need to raise the taxes or save the money somewhere else because we need to pay for it. Also, when we discuss the election or the vote that you mentioned about religion, that was like an accident, considered to be an accident in our system. We had a huge debate after that about how does our integration model work, how do we deal with different religions, and this debate is what it is about in the end. The vote is one thing, the vote can be changed. People vote yes for something, when they realize it doesn't work, they can vote no in 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. But the debate that it triggers, if you responsibilize everybody in a society or in a community, if you can have your say, but you're also held accountable for what you say, then you need to think about what you do because you may also face the consequences. And this is something that we see in the internet with people having access to information if they are not too lazy to go for it. They can be informed. Capacity building is key, but also they need to have the time and the resources. Somebody who is working 15 hours a day may not want to think about domain names or whatever. So you need to support those people that have more difficulties. But if you support them, they should have a right to say. And I will stop with this. Most of my neighbors, Germans, Austrians, Italians, they tell me, like, whenever we talk about direct democracy, well, but the general people are too stupid to decide. You can't let them decide. Or maybe it works in your small country because everybody knows each other and somehow you responsibilize yourself. We are 8 million people. If this system works normally, with exceptions, for 8 million, where is the limit to self-determination? At 10 million people or 20 million people? So this is really something that I would urge you to consider. Thank you.
I appreciate model a lot. I just wanted to say it's not a silver bullet. That
And the UN only works when there is consensus. When there's no consensus, it doesn't work. And this will be the challenge in ICANN. We are supposed to prove that the multi-stakeholder model in ICANN works. If we don't get a consensus on the IANA transition accountability, then the US will have to say, okay, we stay in control because you are not able to change it because you don't agree. So if we want to have the multi-stakeholder model that works in the long run, we will need to develop ways to vote, to take majority decisions and so on and so forth, and then compensate the minorities, because consensus may not always be the solution. We may disagree on things and we'll have to find decision-making models. Thank you. That was a long tweet.
Okay,
so, but 140 characters, Megan.
Well, I'm not sure if I can make it 140 characters because I'm going to quote again. I quoted incorrectly Bismarck at the beginning. And now, perhaps the quote that Churchill is often attributed to is that democracy is a terrible mechanism, but it's the best that we have compared to all the others. And I think that's exactly the situation we have with the multi-stakeholder model for internet governance. As I said at the beginning, and I was joking a little bit, it's messy. It's not easy. It means you have to listen to everyone. It means you have to take into consideration everything. But somehow, out of this stew, you come up with something that is sensible and reasonable. So to turn it into 140 characters, I'm not sure how I do it, but something like multi-stakeholder model is the best of what we know already. Something like that. I have to rewrite it in 140 characters. But.
Thank you. Hristo, your very short reflection.
So I would like to underline one of the very important existing problems in some countries in the region, the lack of expertise. So we must organize, optimize the process of capacity building. It will be a good idea to make this in the region together.
Thank you. Dušan, tweet.
Tweet.
In Cyrillic, please.
Okay. If you have problems, try to solve them with multi-stakeholder models.
That's almost like an ad. Good. Grigori.
First of all, necessary to believe that it's possible to do, and believe governments. It's necessary to involve them. They are not against freedom in the internet. They don't want to participate. Necessary to find a way how to involve them in internet activity. I think is the main problem today.
Thank you. Okay, before the close, we have 5 messages that Anna took, right? Now, in order to kind of support or not support, we are going to simulate one of the famous rough consensus approaches that IETF uses, which is humming. It's a bit more complicated in the IETF, but anyhow. So if you agree with what Anna is going to say, try to hum stronger you can. Okay, so by the voice we are going to see how much support we have. Anna, we go one by one.
Can we?
We have strong hum.
With having the microphones, it's open for everybody, but some are
absolutely not for 5 of you. Anna.
Okay, before you prepare your humming skills, let me just read out all the translations of multi-stakeholderism in 7 different languages. I didn't get a lot of tweets. I think I had one about Romania, but couldn't find it anymore. Maybe he or she deleted it. But then I went through this official European Commission document. Someone linked it, and I went through 7 documents. Let's see what we have. So, starting with the Romanian. Toți actorii interesati. That means all interested actors. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, then Bulgarian with my Russian language. Observatory raznoobrazia. This means should mean diversity, right? Okay, let's. Yeah, because raznoobrazia, this Russian, it means diversity, so should have something to do with it.
Maybe модел, който отчита мненията на всички заинтересовани страни.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay. Let's move on to, for example, German. Beteiligung einer Vielzahl des Akteuren. This should mean involving numerous actors, as Sandra has helped me. And, well, basically, the Danish one, it's complex internet administration ecosystem. Okay. And in Spanish and in French, le part intéressé, and in French should be tout le parties prenant. There should be all parties involved. And in Georgian, as no one is controlling me here, no Georgians, I'll just translate it. Everyone together, I should say that. Okay. I don't think everyone will disagree with me. Okay, and let's move on with the points. All Hamming skills prepared? Okay, let's go with the first one. On global level, we need to come up with minimal standards, safeguards to guarantee a balanced multi-stakeholder model on internet governance. Or to say it short or legally, we need checks and balances for people to trust multi-stakeholder model. Everyone understands? Humming?
Humming is agreed, right?
Good. Very good. Moving to next one. So, stakeholders do not have to know every bit of details of how policies and laws are developed, but decision makers should, and it's crucial for multi-stakeholder model to spend more time on consultations with other stakeholders. How about this? Good. Very good. Moving to the next one, the third one. For multi-stakeholder model, it's not necessary for a entity to have laws or to have an official permission from anyone, government, to have this model inside their entity. Good. No? Not strong enough? Show me the hands who disagree. 1, 2, 3. Disagreement? Shall we pass it? 4. Rough consensus. We pass it. Okay. Fourth. The extent of government involving in multi-stakeholder model is needed to be discussed. The extent of how the government is involving in a multi-stakeholder model, for example, of ICANN or ISOC, how they do their multi-stakeholder model, should be discussed. Well, I am open to modifications, maybe, on that point. Modification, anyone?
ISOC has another status. In the ICANN, we have Governmental Advisory Committee. In ISOC, there is no such body. So it's necessary to divide. If you can say in ICANN, is it but not in ISOC?
Okay.
Yes.
So, sorry? Well, yeah, should be modified. Anyone, maybe you want to modify it, Vladimir? Can we? Okay.
Maybe what you mean is that the role of governments and the other stakeholders vary from depending on the issue that you treat and on the circumstances. So that needs to be discussed.
Okay, let's not make it more tricky. Let's leave out this point, I'd suggest, and move on to the last one. Not only government should become more active, but everyone, every stakeholder, including academia, civil society and others, should get more active. And with having said that and done, digital skills and awareness of stakeholders should be raised on internet governance issues. Oh, good. Very
Wait a
good.
minute, I don't agree. Governments, they don't want to be active. My practice showed me that they don't want to do anything.
But I think they have that they should become more.
No. They don't want to do anything. The main point is how to involve
Okay,
them.
let's not get into the debate because we. Okay, I think the last one has passed, so we have 4 passed amendments or messages. Let's say it like this. And with that said, we are done.
Thank you, Anna. This was a good test of rough consensus. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope it was useful. We have lunch somewhere in room Vitosha. Before that, I'm reminding of a technical thing, the ring. Whoever lost it, it's here. And thank you for coming, and a round of applause for all of you. Thank you.